Hello and welcome. Tonight we journey back in time, not to the gilded halls of power or the monumental tombs that command the world's attention, but to the humble, sun-baked streets and fertile fields of ancient Egypt. We are going to look beyond the pharaohs, past the mystique of the pyramids, to uncover the intricate and deeply human world of the ordinary people who form the true foundation of this enduring civilization. Their lives, governed by the great river and woven together by community, magic, and law, tell a story that is every bit as compelling as that of any king. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. For the vast majority of those who lived and died under the watchful eyes of the sun god Ra, life was not a grand, linear epic, but a cyclical poem. Its stanzas written, erased, and rewritten by the river. The Nile was the great metronome of Egyptian existence, the inexorable, life-giving pulse that dictated the rhythm of work, family, and survival. Its predictable annual inundation, known as Akhet, was not seen as a destructive flood, but as a divine caress, a promise of rebirth from the god Hapi, who embodied the flood itself. This event, which typically began in June and crested by August, was the foundational miracle upon which the entire civilization was built. During these months, the river would swell with the waters from the Ethiopian highlands, spilling over its banks and laying a thick, black, incredibly fertile layer of alluvial silt across the entire floodplain. For the farmers, this was a time of enforced rest from agriculture. Their fields were submerged, transformed into a vast, placid lake. This was not, however, a time of idleness. This seasonal pause in farming was the engine of the state's monumental ambitions. It was during Akhet that the pharaoh could levy a massive workforce for state projects. Tens of thousands of farmers, their agricultural duties suspended, would be conscripted for corvée labor building the pyramids, quarrying stone, erecting temples, and maintaining the vast network of dikes and canals that would be crucial in the coming seasons. For those who remained in their villages, it was a time for mending tools, weaving baskets, repairing homes, and engaging in communal life, all while waiting for the waters to give their land back. The height of the inundation was a matter of critical state importance. All along the river, special structures known as nilometers, often a series of steps leading down into the water, or a marked column measured the flood's peak. A low flood meant less silt and less water for irrigation, leading to smaller harvests and potential famine. A flood that was too high could be catastrophic, destroying homes and washing away dikes. The ideal flood, between 14 and 16 cubits in Thebes, was a cause for celebration, as it promised abundance. The readings from the nilometers were not just for predicting the harvest. They were a primary tool of the bureaucracy, allowing scribes to calculate the tax burden that would be levied on each farmer in the months to come. Then, as the waters began to recede around October, the second season, hooray, the time of growing, an emergence would commence. The land, now dark and damp, was ready. This was when the true, back-breaking labor of the agricultural year began. Under a sky of brilliant, unforgiving blue, the farmers would emerge. Their primary tool was the light wooden plow, or ard, often tipped with bronze for greater durability. Pulled by a pair of yoked oxen, the plow would break the surface of the rich soil. It was not a deep-cutting plow, but it was perfectly suited for turning over the fresh layer of silt. Often a second person, sometimes the farmer's wife or child, would follow behind, raking up the larger clumps of earth with a simple wooden hoe. Once the ground was prepared, the seeds were sown. Emmer wheat and barley were the two foundational crops of Egypt, the raw materials for the two staples of life, bread and beer. The seeds were cast by hand, and then, in a wonderfully efficient process, herds of sheep or goats would be driven across the fields to trample the seeds firmly into the soil, protecting them from birds and the sun. The work was far from over. The success of the crop now depended on irrigation. While the inundation provided the initial saturation, the growing plants needed a steady supply of water. The Egyptians were masters of basin irrigation. They built a complex, cooperative network of earthen dikes and canals to trap the floodwaters in large basins. Sluice gates could then be opened to water the fields as needed. To move water from the lower-lying canals up to the higher fields, they used a device that is still seen in parts of the world today, the shaduf. This was a long pole pivoted on a central post, with a weight on one end and a bucket or leather container on the other. With a simple seesaw motion, a single person could lift a surprising amount of water from the canal to the field with minimal effort. This was repetitive, tiring work performed for hours under the hot sun. Beyond the staple grains, vegetable plots were cultivated closer to the villages. These grew onions, garlic, leeks, beans, lentils, and lettuce, vital components of the common diet. Flax was also grown in abundance, not for food, but for its fibers, which were woven into the linen that clothed the entire population, from the peasant to the pharaoh. Throughout the Péré season, the farmers tended their fields, weeding them by hand, and guarding them from pests, like locusts and birds. Their homes were not the isolated farmsteads of other cultures, but were clustered together in dense villages, creating an intensely communal living environment. The quintessential Egyptian house was a marvel of climate-adapted, sustainable architecture built from the very earth it stood upon. Mud brick. The process was simple and effective. Nile mud, mixed with sand and chopped straw for tensile strength, was pressed into wooden molds and then laid out in the sun to bake until it was as hard as stone. These bricks were the universal building material. The walls of the houses were thick, providing excellent insulation. They absorbed the intense heat of the day, keeping the interior relatively cool, and then radiated that warmth back into the space during the cooler desert nights. Roofs were typically flat, constructed from a layer of palm logs, then a mat of reeds and branches, all covered with a final layer of mud plaster. These flat roofs were a critical extension of the living space, a second story open to the sky. They were used for sleeping on stiflingly hot nights, for drying laundry, for storing grain, and as a social space to gather with family and neighbors in the evening. Windows were deliberately small, placed high up on the walls. They were not for looking out of, but for allowing hot air to escape while minimizing the amount of direct, glaring sunlight that entered the home. Inside, the floors were of packed earth, often covered with woven reed mats. The layout was pragmatic and centered on the needs of the family. A typical house might have a central reception room, often with a single painted wooden column supporting the roof, which served as the primary living and dining area. Off this main room were smaller, more private chambers for sleeping. The furniture was sparse and functional. Low stools, small wooden tables, and storage chests for clothing and valuables were the most common items. Beds were simple wooden frames, with a mattress of woven reeds or padded linen. In a corner, a small alcove or platform might serve as a household shrine. The kitchen was often a designated area in the central room or in an open-air courtyard at the back of the house. It featured a clay oven for baking bread and a hearth for cooking. These homes were the hubs of multi-generational family life. The nuclear family was the core, but it was very common for a household to include grandparents, unmarried siblings, and other extended relatives. This pooling of resources and labor was a fundamental survival strategy. The elderly, unable to perform hard labor in the fields, could care for the very young, mend clothing, and prepare food. Women's lives were centered on the immense and vital task of managing the household, or domus. Their work was relentless. They were responsible for the lengthy process of transforming grain into food, grinding the emmer wheat on a stone quern, a physically demanding task to make coarse flour, then kneading it into dough and baking the daily bread. They brewed. The beer, a thick, nutritious, and mildly alcoholic beverage that was a primary source of calories for the entire family. They spun flax into thread and wove the thread into linen cloth for their family's clothing. They raised the children, tended the sick, and maintained the home. The household was a self-sufficient economic unit, a microcosm of the larger state, and women were its essential managers. We see the most vivid and detailed blueprint of this organized, communal life in the village of Deir el-Medina. Nestled in a desolate, sun-blasted valley on the west bank of the Nile, directly across from the capital of Thebes, this was no ordinary farming village. This was a purpose-built, state-sponsored settlement for the highly skilled artisans and craftsmen who had the sacred and secret task of constructing and decorating the royal tombs in the nearby Valley of the Kings and Valley of the Queens. For over 400 years during the New Kingdom, this village housed the stonecutters, plasterers, scribes, sculptors, and painters who created the eternal homes of the Pharaohs. Because of its isolation and the unique literacy of its inhabitants, Deir el-Medina has provided archaeologists with an unprecedented treasure trove of information about daily life in the form of thousands of ostraka shards of pottery or limestone used as a kind of scratch paper. The village itself was laid out on a formal grid, a long central street flanked by around 70 houses, with another 50 outside the main walled area. This enclosure wall, with a single guarded gate, underscored the secret nature of the inhabitants' work. The houses, though uniform in their external dimensions, show individual modifications inside, reflecting the personal tastes and changing family needs of their owners. Here we see the state's direct involvement in the lives of its workers. These were not peasants. They were salaried government employees. They did not farm for their food, but were paid in rations delivered from the royal storehouses. A typical monthly wage for a worker consisted of several large sacks of emmer wheat and barley, along with regular supplies of fish, vegetables, oil. for lamps and cooking, and, crucially, vast quantities of beer. This system ensured their well-being, freeing them to focus entirely on their monumental work. The work itself was organized into a 10-day week, with 8 days of work and 2 days of rest. During their work week, the men would live in temporary camps in the Valley of the Kings, returning to their families in the village on their days off. The records from dear el-Medina reveal a community that was vibrant, complex, and surprisingly modern. We read their personal letters, their laundry lists, their sales receipts, and their legal complaints. The literacy rate here was exceptionally high, not limited to the official scribes. Many of the craftsmen could read and write, leaving behind a wealth of personal documentation. We learn of their quarrels with neighbors, their love affairs, their religious beliefs, and their economic anxieties. Most remarkably, we have records of the first known labor strikes in recorded history. On several occasions when the state bureaucracy, perhaps strained by war or internal turmoil, failed to deliver their rations on time, the workers of dear el-Medina put down their tools and marched in protest. They would sit down near the major temples on the West Bank, chanting, "We are hungry." This was a bold and risky move, but it demonstrates their strong sense of collective identity and their belief that they were entitled to the wages they had been promised. Dear el-Medina, therefore, is more than just a ruined village. It is a perfectly preserved microcosm of an organized Egyptian community, a place where individual lives, with all their joys and struggles, were interwoven into a collective identity, their destinies tied to both the will of the Pharaoh and the unyielding, life-giving cycles of the great river. While the state religion of Egypt was a grand, imposing edifice of monumental temples, colossal statues, and elaborate, inscrutable rituals presided over by a powerful and wealthy priesthood, the spiritual life of the average person was a far more intimate, pragmatic, and eclectic affair. It was a rich and tangled tapestry woven from the threads of official doctrine, ancient local traditions, deep-seated superstitions, and the constant, practical application of magic. For the farmer watching the sky for rain, the craftsman hoping to avoid injury from his tools, or the woman facing the life-threatening peril of childbirth, the great gods of the pantheon, Ra in his solar bark, Amun in his Karnak sanctuary, were often distant and abstract figures. Their spiritual needs were more immediate, more personal. Their world was alive with a multitude of invisible forces, and interacting with this world required a different set of tools. This was the realm of popular religion, a belief system that ran parallel to, and often intertwined with, the state cult, serving the urgent, everyday needs of the people. At the very heart of this personal spirituality was the concept of Hika, the Egyptian word for magic. To our modern minds, the distinction between religion, seen as good and official, and magic, often seen as fringe or manipulative, is clear. For the ancient Egyptians, this distinction did not exist. Heka was not a dark art or a form of cheating the gods. It was a fundamental primordial force, a power that the gods themselves had used to create and sustain the universe. The creator god, whether Adam or Ptah, depending on the tradition, had used Heka to bring the world into being. Deities like Isis were masters of Heka, using it to heal, to protect, and to work their will. Therefore, when humans used Heka, They were not subverting the divine order. They were participating in it, using a legitimate tool that was an inherent part of the cosmic structure. The official high priests in the temples were masters of Heka, using it in the complex rituals that ensured the sun would rise and the Nile would flood. They were known as lector priests, or Kerheb, who could read the sacred texts and unlock their power. But Heka was not their exclusive domain. It was also accessible to the common person through spoken spells, ritual actions, and most ubiquitously, and importantly, through the wearing of amulets. Amulets were the bedrock of personal protection, the spiritual armor of the ordinary Egyptian. These were small charms, worn on the body as part of a necklace or bracelet, woven into clothing, or most crucially, placed within the linen wrappings of the deceased to protect them on their journey through the underworld. Their power was derived from three things: the material they were made from, their shape or form, and the magical spells that might be spoken over them during their creation. They were crafted from a vast array of materials. For the poor, a simple amulet might be made of clay or wood. More common was faience, a non-clay ceramic made of crushed quartz, which could be glazed in a brilliant blue-green color that symbolized life and rebirth. For the wealthy, amulets were fashioned from semi-precious stones, each with its own symbolic meaning. Lapis lazuli, with its deep blue color flecked with gold, was associated with the heavens and the gods. Carnelian, a reddish-orange stone, symbolized blood, energy, and life. Green turquoise was associated with fertility and new growth. The form of the amulet was paramount. The ankh, the hieroglyphic sign for life, was perhaps the most powerful all-purpose symbol, a potent charm for health and vitality in this life and the next. The Djed pillar, a symbol thought to represent the backbone of the god Osiris, was a powerful emblem of stability, strength, and endurance. To wear a Djed amulet was to invoke the regenerative power of the great god of the afterlife. The Eye of Horus, or Udjet, was one of the most potent protective symbols of all, representing the eye that Horus lost in his battle with his uncle Seth, and which was magically restored by Thoth. The Udjat symbolized healing, restoration, wholeness, and protection from evil. An Egyptian might wear an Udjat amulet to ward off sickness or to recover from an injury. The scarab beetle, or Keper, was a powerful symbol of rebirth and renewal. Seeing the beetle rolling a ball of dung across the sand, from which new beetles would emerge, the Egyptians saw a parallel to the sun god Ra pushing the sun across the sky each day. A scarab amulet, especially the heart scarab placed on a mummy, was meant to ensure the deceased's rebirth in the afterlife. The repertoire of amulets was vast and highly specific. A pregnant woman facing one of the greatest dangers of ancient life would never be without an amulet of Tauret, the goddess of childbirth. Depicted as a fearsome hybrid of a hippopotamus, a lion, and a crocodile, Tauret's terrifying appearance was meant to scare away the demons that threatened mother and child. The Tayet, or knot of Isis, a symbol resembling an ankh with its arms drooping, was another powerful protective amulet for women, associated with the magic of the great mother goddess. Amulets in the shape of scorpions or frogs, a symbol of fertility, were common. Amulets shaped like a two-fingered salute were placed on mummies to help them in the afterlife. Every Egyptian, from the pharaoh to the peasant, was surrounded by these objects from birth to death, each one a silent, constant prayer worn against the skin. Magic was also a thoroughly practical tool for solving life's problems. If a person fell ill, their family would likely seek out a physician, or swanwi. This physician would examine the patient and prescribe a remedy based on a corpus of medical knowledge, such as that recorded in the papyrus Ebers. They might prescribe a poultice, a herbal concoction, or even perform simple surgery. However, the prescription would almost certainly be accompanied by a magical spell or incantation that had to be recited as the medicine was administered. The Egyptians believed that most illnesses were caused by the intrusion of a malevolent spirit, a vengeful ghost, or the anger of a god. The physical remedy treated the symptoms, but the magical spell was necessary to attack the root cause, to banish the demon or appease the god. The two were not seen as contradictory, but as complementary, parts of a single, holistic healing process. A spell against a headache, for instance, might involve reciting a myth about Horus and his head pain, while applying a poultice of herbs. Magic was invoked for matters of the heart, revealing a deeply human side of Egyptian life filled with the same passions and anxieties we feel today. Love spells inscribed on papyri or pottery of Straka have been found, providing remarkably detailed instructions on how to win the affection of a desired person. Some spells were gentle, asking the gods to make the target's heart incline towards the caster. Others were more aggressive, seeking to create a maddening, sleepless obsession in the target until they submitted to the caster's desire. These spells often required sympathetic magic, using a figurine to represent the target, or incorporating something personal like a strand of their hair into the ritual. Curses, too, were part of this magical arsenal. Execration texts were written on clay figurines or pots, which were then ceremonially smashed to magically harm an enemy of the state or a personal foe. The line between religion and magic, so clear to us, was for the average Egyptian almost non-existent. They would certainly worship the great state gods like Ra, Osiris, and Isis, and they would eagerly participate in the grand public festivals that honored them. But their daily spiritual practice was focused on a more local and accessible pantheon. Small, informal shrines could be found in villages, and almost every home had a small niche or altar dedicated to household deities. Chief among these was Bes, a grotesque but benevolent dwarf god. With his lion-like mane, protruding tongue, and bandy legs, he was a protector of the household, said to drive away snakes, scorpions, and evil spirits with his fearsome appearance. He was also, paradoxically, a god of joy, music, dance, and a particular guardian of women in childbirth. Alongside him was his consort, Beset, and the ever-present Tauret. The Egyptians also venerated their recent dead, believing that their ancestor spirits, the Ak, could play an active role in the lives of the living. Families would leave offerings at their tombs and write letters to the dead, asking them for help, seeking their blessing, or even complaining to them about family squabbles. It was a living relationship that transcended the barrier of death. They believed the world was teeming with invisible forces that had to be constantly negotiated. The desert was seen as the domain of chaos, home to malevolent demons that could bring sickness and misfortune. Certain times of day, like the twilight hour, were considered more dangerous, a time when the veil between worlds was thin. It was this belief system that made Heka so essential. Magic was simply the established, sensible, and effective technology for interacting with this unseen world. It was a way to impose a measure of control and agency on a life that was often precarious and uncertain. It was how one could ward off the scorpion's sting, ensure a good harvest, heal a sick child, and navigate the complex and invisible web of fate and divine will. This popular, personal, and practical magic was not a contradiction of the state religion, but its essential, living counterpart, the spiritual operating system that gave the common Egyptian a sense of power and protection in the vast, mysterious, and often dangerous cosmos. The popular image of ancient Egypt is often dominated by the figure of the pharaoh, an absolute monarch, a living god on earth whose word was law and whose authority was unquestionable. This vision suggests a rigid, top-down system of power, leaving little room for the rights, grievances, or legal recourse of the common person. It evokes a society where the will of the powerful was the only law that mattered. Yet, the surviving trove of legal documents, painstakingly written on papyri and casually jotted on limestone ostraca paints, a far more complex, nuanced, and frankly surprising picture of the Egyptian legal world. While Egyptian society was undeniably and rigidly hierarchical, its entire legal and ethical system was built upon a profound, pervasive, and powerful principle that, in theory, extended its protective umbrella over everyone, regardless of social status. The concept of Ma'at was not simply a goddess with an ostrich feather on her head, though she was personified as such. She was a divine embodiment of truth, justice, balance, harmony, and cosmic order. Ma'at was the fundamental principle that governed the entire universe, from the predictable journey of the sun across the sky to the moral conduct of human beings. It was the natural, correct state of things, the opposite of Isfet chaos, injustice, and falsehood. The pharaoh's primary and most sacred duty was to uphold and maintain Ma'at on earth. All his laws, decrees, and actions were meant to be an expression of this cosmic principle. Consequently, every official who served him, from the highest vizier in the capital to the lowest local magistrate in a remote village, was expected to act as an agent of Ma'at. For the common farmer, craftsman, or woman, this was a profoundly important concept. It meant that justice was not a gift bestowed by the powerful, but a divine right, an inherent part of the world's proper functioning. It provided a moral and legal framework that, at least aspirationally, offered a path for redress against wrongdoing. The Egyptian legal system was not based on a single, comprehensive written legal code like the famous Code of Hammurabi from Mesopotamia. There was no book of laws that one could consult. Instead, the system operated on a combination of tradition, precedent what had been decided in similar cases before, and the expert judgment of officials who were expected to be deeply imbued with the principles of Ma'at. For the majority of ordinary people, justice was administered locally. Minor disputes, a disagreement over the ownership of a donkey, an accusation of petty theft, a boundary dispute between neighboring farms were typically handled by a local council known as a kenbet. This was not a panel of professional judges, but a council of respected local notables, village elders, senior craftsmen, local priests, or minor officials. They would convene in a public space, perhaps the gate of the village or under a shady tree, and hear the case. The proceedings were remarkably formal. The accuser and the accused would present their cases orally. Witnesses would be called to give testimony, and they were required to swear a solemn oath to tell the truth. This oath was a serious matter, often invoking the name of a god and the life of the pharaoh. As Amun endures and as the ruler endures, to swear a false oath was not just perjury. It was a grave sin that would endanger one's fate in the afterlife. Evidence could be presented, most often in the form of written documents. Despite widespread illiteracy, written contracts were a common feature of Egyptian life for important transactions like the sale of land, loans, or marriages. A local scribe would be employed to draw up the document, which would then be witnessed and kept as a legal record. If a dispute arose, the papyrus contract was powerful evidence. After hearing all sides, the Kennet would deliberate and deliver a verdict. For more serious crimes, such as murder, official corruption, or cases involving state property, like a royal tomb, the case would be brought before a higher court presided over by a professional official, ultimately leading up to the office of the vizier. The vizier was the pharaoh's right-hand man, the supreme head of the entire state administration, including the justice system. The installation of the vizier, a text from the New Kingdom, describes the pharaoh instructing his new vizier to be impartial. See to it that you do all things in accordance with the law. Do not distinguish between a man you know and one. You do not between the one who is close to you and the one who is far away. The ideal was clear. Justice should be blind. We have a wealth of surviving records that show this system in action. The case of the tomb worker Panab from the village of Deir el-Medina is a famous and scandalous example. Panab was the chief, workman or foreman of one of the crews working in the Valley of the Kings. He was accused by a rival scribe, a menact of a staggering list of crimes detailed on a papyrus now in the British Museum. The accusations included stealing stone from the ongoing construction of the pharaoh's tomb to build his own, embezzling tools, forcing the workmen to do personal work for him, intimidating and attacking villagers, and committing adultery with married women. While the case highlights rampant corruption in a high-ranking official, the very existence of the menac's detailed, formal complaint is profound. It demonstrates that a system was in place for an individual to formally accuse a powerful superior and have a reasonable expectation of a hearing. Amenecht clearly had faith that the legal system guided by Map could reign in a corrupt official like Panab. Perhaps most surprising to a modern observer was the extensive legal status of women in ancient Egypt, which was far superior to that of their counterparts in ancient Greece, Rome, and many other cultures. In the eyes of Egyptian law, women were not the property of their fathers or husbands. They were legal individuals. They could own, manage, and inherit property in their own right. They could enter into legally binding contracts, and they could sue and be sued in court without needing a male guardian to represent them. Marriage was a civil contract, not a religious sacrament, and women had the right to initiate a divorce. Upon divorce, a woman was entitled to her original dowry and typically received 1/3 of all the communal property that had been accumulated during the marriage. The Will of a Woman Named Nonacade, also from dear el-Medina, provides a stunning example of these rites in practice. Nanact, in her old age, drew up a formal declaration, witnessed by the local Kenbet, regarding her 8 surviving children. She praised the children who had taken care of her in her old age, and confirmed that they would receive their share of her property. However, she explicitly and legally disinherited 3 of her children who she felt had neglected her. She declared, "They are good for nothing. They shall not have a share with the children who have taken care of me." The fact that a woman could have such agency over her own property and the legal standing to formally disinherit her own children speaks volumes about the level of justice and personal autonomy available to women. Of course, we must not romanticize the system. The reality on the ground did not always live up to the lofty ideal of Matt. A poor peasant farmer bringing a case against a wealthy, powerful landowner who had friends in high places would have faced a daunting, perhaps insurmountable, uphill battle. Bribery and corruption were undeniable realities, as the case of Paneb demonstrates. The system was administered by fallible human beings with all their inherent flaws of greed, bias, and favoritism. Punishments could be severe. For minor offenses, beatings with a cane or bastinade were a common sentence. More serious crimes could lead to forced labor in the mines or quarries, often a death sentence or exile to the remote and desolate desert oases. For the most heinous crimes like treason or robbing a royal tomb, capital punishment was employed, sometimes through impalement, drowning, or being burned alive. Yet, the ideal of Matt remained a powerful cultural and religious force. An official who was known to be unjust risked not only social condemnation in his community, but more terrifyingly, divine punishment in the afterlife. The most important moment for any Egyptian was the final judgment before the god Osiris. In the Hall of Two Truths, the deceased's heart would be weighed on a scale against a feather of Matt. To pass this test, the deceased had to recite the negative confession from the Book of the Dead, declaring to the 42 divine judges that they had not committed a long list of sins. This list included crimes like murder and theft, but it was dominated by social and ethical transgressions. I have not told lies. I have not been deceitful. I have not made anyone weep. And crucially, I have not obstructed justice. The deep-seated belief that every soul would ultimately be held accountable to the perfect standard of Matt served as a powerful moral compass. The Egyptian legal system was not a perfect machine of justice, but it was far from the arbitrary and brutal rule of a despot. It was a complex living system built on a profound ethical foundation that gave ordinary people a voice, a mechanism for recourse, and the deeply held hope that truth, order, and justice could and should prevail. In the rigidly stratified social pyramid of ancient Egypt, the line between the 99% who were illiterate and the tiny, privileged elite who could read and write was the sharpest and most significant division of all. For the overwhelming majority of the population, life was a continuum of inherited physical labor, a world where skills were passed down not through texts and treatises, but through the intimate, hands-on guidance of a parent. Knowledge was tactile, learned through the feel of the plow, the texture of the clay, or the grain of the wood. For a select few, however, the arduous path of the scribe offered a route away from the blistering sun and the back-breaking toil of the fields, and into the shaded, respected world of administration, influence, and relative comfort. Education was the sole key to this world, but its doors were barred to all but a tiny fraction of society. Literacy was the exclusive and jealously guarded preserve of a small caste, primarily consisting of boys from affluent or well-connected families. The sons of high officials, priests, and successful merchants were the most likely candidates for a formal education. This education began at a young age, perhaps 5 or 6, in a school known as the At-Siba, or House of Instruction. These were often attached to a temple or a government department. Here, under the strict and often severe tutelage of a master scribe, students would embark on the long and monumentally difficult process of learning the Egyptian writing systems. This was no simple alphabet. The student had to master hieratic, a cursive script used for everyday administrative and literary texts, which contained hundreds of signs. For monumental inscriptions, they also had to learn the beautiful and even more complex hieroglyphic script, with its thousands of pictorial signs that could represent sounds, objects, or abstract ideas. The curriculum was relentlessly practical, designed not to foster critical thinking or artistic expression, but to produce competent and loyal bureaucrats for the vast machinery of the state. The primary teaching method was rote memorization and endless copying. Students would spend countless hours with their simple tools, a palette holding cakes of black and red ink, a jar of water to wet the brush, and a set of reed pens. Because papyrus, the paper of ancient Egypt, was expensive, their practice work was done on cheap, reusable materials. They would write on wooden boards coated with a thin layer of gesso that could be washed clean, or, most commonly, on ostraca shards of broken pottery or flakes of limestone that were abundant and free. They copied not the great myths or epic poems, but a standardized set of model texts. These included sample letters for official correspondence, legal contracts, mathematical problems related to calculating grain quotas or land area, and, most importantly, wisdom literature. These wisdom texts were moralistic and didactic works, collections of proverbs and advice, often framed as a father's instruction to his son. One of the most famous, the Satire of the Trades, also known as the Instruction of Ducati, was a core part of the scribal curriculum. In this text, a father taking his son to the scribal school systematically describes the misery of every other possible profession to convince the boy of the superiority of the scribe's life. The metal worker, he says, has fingers like a crocodile's, skin and stinks more than fish roe. The potter is covered in soil and grinds himself into the ground. The weaver is cooped up and beaten by his master. The farmer's cry is eternal. The message, hammered home again and again, was clear. All manual labor is wretched. Be a scribe, the text concludes. It is the greatest of all callings. There is nothing that surpasses it on this earth. This was powerful propaganda designed to instill a sense of elite identity and a mild contempt for the very laborers whose work supported their existence. Discipline in these schools was notoriously harsh, encapsulated in the famous saying, "A boy's ears are on his back. He listens when he is beaten." The cane was considered an essential tool of pedagogy. for the vast majority of Egyptian children who never set foot in a house of instruction, education was entirely vocational and familial. A son would learn his father's trade by becoming his shadow, his apprentice from the moment he was old enough to help. The son of a farmer learned the sacred rhythms of the Nile, the intricate techniques of plowing and sowing, the constant vigilance required to maintain irrigation canals. The son of a potter learned the secrets of the clay, how to find it, prepare it, center it on the wheel, and coax it into the shape of a vessel, and the perilous art of firing it in the kiln without it cracking. The son of a fisherman learned the subtle language of the river, the hidden habits of the fish, the precise way to cast a net, and the patient skill of mending it. Daughters, similarly, learned the vast and complex repertoire of domestic skills from their mothers, preparing them for their future role as managers of their own households. This system of direct generational knowledge transfer created an incredibly stable and predictable social structure, ensuring the continuity of all the essential skills required to keep the civilization running. But it also forged the bars of a social cage. The station you were born into was, in almost all cases, the station you would die in. However, the social pyramid, while steep and imposing, was not entirely seamless. The walls were high, but not insurmountable. For a common man with ambition and courage, the most prominent path to advancement was through military service. The army, particularly during the expansionist New Kingdom, was a potential avenue for social mobility. A young man could distinguish himself through bravery, loyalty, and skill in battle. A soldier who caught the eye of his commander could be promoted through the ranks. Distinguished service was rewarded handsomely with a share of plunder from campaigns, grants of land, and even the gold of valor, ornate golden necklaces bestowed personally by the pharaoh. Some of the highest officials in the land, and even some pharaohs like Horemheb, rose from common or military backgrounds. This path was, of course, fraught with extreme peril, but it represented one of the few institutionalized avenues where merit, or at least martial prowess, could potentially override the circumstances of one's birth. Exceptional skill in a craft could also offer a limited form of upward mobility. A particularly talented sculptor, painter, or architect might be singled out and chosen to work on a prestigious royal project, like the temples of Karnak or the tombs at dear el-Medina. Such a position came with significant prestige, and as seen with the dear el-Medina community, a stable, salaried life of greater security and status than that of a common laborer. These servants in the place of truth, as the tomb builders called themselves, occupied a unique and highly respected niche in Egyptian society. They were still laborers, but they were elite laborers, masters of their craft working directly for the god-king. While this did not catapult them into the land-owning upper class, it set them far above their peasant contemporaries. The architect, Imhotep, who designed the step pyramid for King Djoser in the Old Kingdom, is the ultimate, albeit legendary, example. A commoner by birth, his genius was so great that he rose to become the king's vizier and was later deified as a god of wisdom and medicine. Ultimately, however, the figure of the scribe remained the paramount symbol of a different, elevated kind of life. Scribes were the indispensable cogs and gears in the vast, complex machinery of the Egyptian state. They were the nervous system of the bureaucracy, They fanned out across the country to record the harvest yields from every farm, providing the data needed to calculate and levy taxes. They staffed the legal system, drafting contracts and recording court proceedings. They managed the sprawling estates of the temples and palaces, keeping meticulous inventories of everything from grain sacks to temple vestments. They composed the official histories that glorified the Pharaoh's reign and the religious texts that guided the dead. Their ability to read and write was a formidable form of power, a technology that set them apart from the illiterate masses they administered. They were the gatekeepers of information, the architects of bureaucracy, and the preservers of tradition. The cool, detached shadow cast by the scribe, a figure exempt from physical labor, a master of the sacred and administrative word, was a constant, silent reminder of the deep and defining chasm that structured Egyptian society, a world where skills were passed down like heirlooms, and the road to a different life was a narrow, steep, and seldom traveled path. Life in ancient Egypt may have been largely defined by the relentless cycle of hard labor and the confines of a rigid social structure, but it was far from a monotonous, gray existence devoid of pleasure, color, and personal connection. Woven deeply into the sturdy, practical fabric of daily toil were vibrant threads of leisure, celebration, community, and deeply felt emotion. The Egyptians, pragmatic and life-affirming, understood the profound necessity of respite and revelry. They embraced moments of joy with a vivacity and spirit that still echoes through their art, their literature, and the humble artifacts they left behind. Theirs was a world where hard work was balanced by celebration, and where public duty coexisted with a rich and intimate private life. Music, song, and dance were not luxuries reserved for the elite. They were popular forms of entertainment that permeated all levels of society. At the lavish banquets and festivals of the wealthy, as depicted in countless tomb paintings, professional troupes of musicians and dancers would entertain the guests. These scenes show slender women playing graceful arched harps, men strumming on lutes and lyres, and others playing double reed pipes that produced a haunting, reedy sound. Dancers, often young women with long braided hair, performed elegant and sometimes highly acrobatic routines, their movements captured in a fluid, stylized grace. For the common person, entertainment was more informal, but no less vital. A simple, homemade reed flute, a handheld drum made of stretched animal skin, and the rhythmic clapping of hands could provide the lively soundtrack for a village celebration or a family gathering after a day's work. Storytelling was a cherished art form. In the cool of the evening, families and neighbors would gather to listen to tales of gods and goddesses, stories of magic and adventure, and fables with moral lessons passed down through the generations. By word of mouth, board games were a universal passion, enjoyed by adults and children, peasants and pharaohs alike. The most famous and widespread of these is Senet, a game of strategy and chance played on a rectangular board of 30 squares. Beautifully crafted Senet boards made of ebony, ivory, and faience have been found in the tombs of royalty, most notably in the tomb of Tutankhamun. But the game was not just for kings. Simpler versions, crudely scratched into stone steps, temple floors, or even just the earth, show that it was played by everyone. Senet was more than a mere pastime. It was deeply symbolic of the journey of the soul, the Ba, through the perilous landscape of the underworld. Each square had a meaning, and the goal was to safely navigate one's pieces off the board and into the afterlife. The popularity of Senet speaks volumes about the Egyptian ability to seamlessly blend the sacred with the profane, finding daily entertainment in a game that also reflected their most profound beliefs about life, death, and eternity. Other games, like Man, the Coiled One, played on a spiral board, and the game of Hounds and Jackals, a race game with beautiful playing pieces, were also popular. For children, archaeologists have found simple toys, carved wooden animals with moving parts, spinning tops, and paddle dolls with strings of clay beads for hair. The local marketplace was the vibrant, chaotic, and noisy heart of the community. For most of ancient Egypt's long history, the economy functioned without physical coinage. This did not mean trade was primitive. On the contrary, it was a sophisticated and well-understood barter system. The market was a nexus of this system, a bustling hub of social and economic interaction. Here, a farmer with a surplus of grain could directly trade his produce for other necessities. He might trade a sack of barley for a new pair of leather sandals, or a basket of onions for a set of cooking pots from a local ceramicist. A fisherman could exchange his morning's catch for a supply of beer. This was a system that required constant, good-natured negotiation and a widely shared implicit understanding of the relative value of different goods. To facilitate more complex transactions, a standardized unit of value, the deben, was used. The deben was not a coin, but a measure of weight, equivalent to about 91 grams of copper, though silver was also used. An item, a cow, a coffin, a piece of land, could be valued at a certain number of deben of copper. This allowed for complex trades where goods of unequal value could be exchanged, with the difference being paid in other items like grain or linen until the agreed-upon value was met. These markets were far more than just economic centers. They were the primary social hubs of the village, the places where news from the capital was shared, where gossip was exchanged, and where the essential bonds of the community were constantly reaffirmed through daily interaction. Even personal relationships and the expression of emotion, often depicted with a sense of formal, stylized stiffness in official art, are revealed to have been filled with a warmth, tenderness, and intimacy that is startlingly familiar. This hidden world is revealed in more private and personal sources. The love poems that became particularly popular during the New Kingdom are remarkable for their passionate and lyrical intensity. Written from both male and female perspectives, they speak with a modern voice of longing, desire, praise, and the sickness of love. One smitten boy describes the object of his affection as the one without a peer, the most beautiful of all, and complains that when he has not seen her for 7 days, sickness has invaded me. A girl speaks of her beloved's voice, which confuses my heart. These are not the formal pronouncements of a Stoic culture. They are the universal expressions of human love. Letters exchanged between family members, preserved on papyrus and ostraca, reveal the everyday concerns and deep affection that bound them together. A husband away from home on business writes to his wife, anxiously inquiring about her health and the state of the household, and expressing his deep longing to return to her. The letters to the dead, written on bowls and left at tombs, show a belief in a continued, active relationship with deceased relatives. In these letters, the living might ask a dead husband or mother for help with a problem, to intervene in a family dispute from the afterlife, or even to stop haunting them if they were believed to be a troublesome spirit. Tomb art, too, offers carefully chosen glimpses into this personal world. Beyond the formal, idealized depictions of the tomb owner, we see small, telling, tender gestures. A husband and wife depicted with their arms around each other or holding hands. A father affectionately touching his young child's face, a mother nursing her baby. These images were not just decorative. They were magical, intended to perpetuate these loving, essential bonds for all eternity. Festivals, both the great national religious events and smaller local celebrations, provided the ultimate outlet for communal joy and social cohesion. These were sanctioned and eagerly anticipated breaks from the routine of labor. Major festivals, like the Opet Festival at Thebes, involved grand public processions where the statues of the gods were carried out from their temple sanctuaries to visit other shrines, their journey followed by thousands of cheering people. For the common person, these were opportunities to feel a direct connection to the state gods and to receive their blessing. But all festivals, big and small, were primarily occasions to feast, drink, and celebrate as a community. The state or local temple would distribute large quantities of bread and especially beer. The Egyptian beer or henket was thick, nutritious, and a staple of the diet for all classes, but during festivals it was consumed in vast quantities for pleasure and intoxication. These events honoring a god or marking a crucial point in the agricultural calendar, like the harvest, brought the entire community together. They were a necessary release valve for the pressures of daily life, reinforcing social bonds and reminding everyone, from the highest official to the humblest farmer, that they were part of a single, divinely ordered, and often joyful society. By looking at these moments of leisure, commerce, and personal affection, we see beyond the silent stone monuments and find the true, beating heart of ancient Egypt, a world of real people who worked hard, but also loved, played, and celebrated. The gift of life with a profound and enduring spirit. In the grand tapestry of ancient Egyptian life, the most fundamental threads were spun from grain and water. The rhythm of the Nile dictated survival, but it was the daily transformation of its bounty into food and drink that gave life its substance and flavor. For the ordinary Egyptian, the world revolved around the hearth and the granary. Their diet, shaped by the predictable generosity of the river and the sun, was the fuel for building pyramids, the solace at the end of a long day's labor, and a primary medium for their connection with the gods. To understand the common person of ancient Egypt is to understand what they ate for their table. Humble as it may have been, was the very center of their world, the undisputed cornerstones of this diet, the twin pillars that supported the entire civilization were bread and beer. They were not merely food and drink. They were currency, symbols of life, and the primary form of payment for labor. The words for bread, and beer, henket, were synonymous with food and sustenance in general, and the standard greeting, bread and beer, was essentially a wish for prosperity and well-being. The production of bread was a constant, daily, and physically demanding task, performed almost exclusively by the women of the household. It began with the grain itself, primarily emmer wheat, a hardy ancient grain with a tough outer husk. The first step was to pound the grain in a large mortar to separate the chaff, after which it was winnowed by tossing it in the air. The cleaned grain was then ground into flour. This was done on a saddle quern, a slightly concave stone on which the grinder, usually a woman, knelt and pushed a smaller, loaf-shaped stone back and forth. It was arduous, back-breaking work that over years left its mark on the skeletons of Egyptian women, showing evidence of arthritis in the back and knees. The resulting flour was coarse and, despite the winnowing, invariably contained particles of sand from the desert environment and grit from the grinding stone itself. This grit was a major factor in the notoriously poor dental health of the ancient Egyptians, as it relentlessly wore down their teeth over a lifetime of chewing. Once the flour was ready, it was mixed with water and kneaded into a dough. For leavening, they could use a sourdough starter, a piece of dough saved from the previous day's baking that contained active wild yeasts. This would be worked into the new batch. The variety of bread was surprisingly vast, simple, unleavened. Flatbreads could be cooked quickly on a hot stone or on the outside of a hot ceramic vessel. The most common form was a dense, hearty loaf baked in a special conical pottery mold. These molds, known as bedia, were heated in the embers of a fire. The dough was placed inside, and the whole thing was covered with another hot pot to bake. This method produced a distinctive conical loaf that is seen in countless offering scenes. For special occasions, the dough could be enriched with honey, dates, or spices, and shaped into figures of animals or people. Bread was eaten at every meal, forming the bulk of the caloric intake for the entire population. The second pillar, beer, was not the clear, carbonated beverage we know today. Egyptian beer was a thick, nutritious, and mildly alcoholic porridge-like substance, more of a food than a drink. It was the primary source of hydration, as plain water from the Nile or canals could be contaminated. The brewing process was closely linked to baking. Special beer bread was made from a richly yeasted dough that was only partially baked, so the enzymes within were not destroyed. This bread was then crumbled into a large vat, mixed with water, and sometimes sweetened with dates or date juice. The mixture was left to ferment in the warm Egyptian air, the wild yeasts from the bread activating to convert the sugars into alcohol. After fermentation, the thick mash was strained through a sieve or cloth bag to separate the liquid beer from the dregs. The resulting beverage was cloudy, nourishing, and a vital source of vitamins and proteins. It was consumed by everyone, from the youngest children to the oldest adults. Workers on state projects like the artisans of dear el-Medina received daily beer rations as part of their wages, often several liters a day. It was a social lubricant, a ritual beverage, and a fundamental part of daily nutrition, beyond bread and beer. The Nile provided the primary source of protein for the common person. Fish. The river, its canals, and the marshy delta teemed with life. Fishermen, using flaxen nets, wicker traps, and bronze hooks, brought in a daily catch of tilapia, catfish, mullet, and perch. Fishing scenes from tombs show men working from small papyrus skiffs, their nets bulging with fish. The catch would be brought back to the village, where it would be eaten fresh or preserved for later use. Preservation was crucial in the hot climate. Fish were split open, cleaned, and then either salted heavily or sun-dried on lines, creating a durable, protein-rich food source that could be stored for months. While fish was ubiquitous for the commoner, poultry and red meat were more of a luxury. Geese, ducks, and pigeons were raised in household pens or hunted in the marshes. These would be roasted for a special meal or a festival day. The most prestigious meat, beef, was largely the preserve of the wealthy elite and the temple-offering cults. A peasant farmer might own a cow or an ox, but this animal was far too valuable as a draft animal for plowing to be slaughtered. For its meat, except perhaps for a major village-wide celebration, pork was also consumed, though its status is complex. It was sometimes associated with the god Seth and considered impure, yet archaeological evidence shows that pigs were widely kept in villages. The black earth of the Nile Valley also produced a rich variety of vegetables, which formed a crucial part of the daily diet. These were grown in small, intensively cultivated garden plots near the home, watered by hand using a shadatuf. The most important of these were onions, garlic, and leeks. These alliums were not just staples. They were revered for their supposed medicinal and strength-giving properties. The Greek historian Herodotus even claimed that the pyramids were inscribed with a record of the vast quantities of onions and garlic consumed by the workers who built them. Lentils, chickpeas, and fava beans provided another important source of plant-based protein. Lettuce, radishes, cucumbers, and gourds were also common. For sweetness, the Egyptians relied on fruit. Dates were the most important, eaten fresh or dried into a sweet, energy-rich paste. Figs, pomegranates, and grapes were also cultivated. Grapes were primarily grown for wine, which, unlike beer, was an elite beverage, enjoyed by the wealthy and used in temple rituals. For the commoner, the sweetness of a ripe date or fig was the most common treat. The Egyptian kitchen was a simple affair. Cooking was done over an open hearth or in a small, cylindrical clay oven located in a courtyard or a designated corner of the house to keep the smoke and heat outside the main living quarters. Food was boiled in clay pots, roasted over the open fire, or fried in earthenware pans with a little animal fat or sesame oil. Meals were eaten from simple clay bowls and plates, often without utensils, using bread to scoop up stews and vegetables. Food was also central to their relationship with the dead. The Egyptians believed that the deceased's spirit, the Ka, required nourishment to survive in the afterlife. The ideal tomb scene always included a depiction of a table piled high with an impossible abundance of food. Loaves of bread, roasted ducks, joints of beef, baskets of figs, and jars of wine and beer. It was a magical menu intended to provide sustenance for eternity through its depiction. For those who could afford it, a sole priest was hired to perform a daily offering ritual at the tomb chapel. For the ordinary family, this duty fell to them. On festival days, the entire family would troop out to the local necropolis to share a meal with their departed ancestors. They would leave offerings of real bread and beer at the tomb, and then have a celebratory picnic in the presence of the dead, reinforcing the unbreakable bond between the living and the deceased. The food on the Egyptian table, therefore, tells a story that goes far beyond simple nutrition. It speaks of a people deeply connected to their land, resourceful in their methods, and firm in their belief that a shared meal of bread and beer was a joy to be cherished in this life and the next. For the ancient Egyptians, the human body was not merely a vessel of flesh and blood. It was a microcosm of the cosmos, a sacred temple for the soul that was intricately connected to the unseen world of gods, spirits, and magical forces. Consequently, their approach to health and medicine was a complex, holistic system, a fascinating blend of empirical observation, practical remedies, and profound magical belief. The line we draw between a doctor and a priest was almost non-existent. Healing was a cooperative effort that sought to treat the physical symptoms while simultaneously confronting the supernatural root cause. To fall ill was not just a biological event. It was a sign of a disruption in the cosmic order, a battle that had to be fought on both physical and spiritual planes. At the forefront of this battle were the healers, of which there were several types. The most secular in our terms was the Swanui, pronounced Su-no, the physician. These were trained professionals, often literate, who belonged to a well-established hierarchy and could specialize in different areas. We know of dentists, ophthalmologists, and even a shepherd of the anus, a specialist in proctology. These physicians worked from a body of knowledge that had been compiled and passed down over centuries, most famously recorded in a series of medical papyri. The most important of these are the Papyrus Ebers and the Edwin Smith Papyrus. The Papyrus Ebers, a vast compendium of over 800 remedies and magical spells, deals with a wide range of internal ailments, from digestive troubles to heart disease and depression. It reads like a practical handbook, listing symptoms and then providing a prescription, often a mixture of plant, animal, and mineral ingredients. Alongside the physical prescription would be a magical incantation to be recited over the patient or the medicine itself. This demonstrates the inseparable nature of their medical philosophy. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, in stark contrast, is a remarkably rational and scientific document. It is believed to be a copy of a much older text, possibly a trauma surgeon's manual, from a battlefield or a construction site. It presents 48 cases of physical injury, starting with the head and working its way down the body. Each case is laid out in a logical, consistent format: title, examination, diagnosis, and treatment. The author uses a methodical approach, advising the physician to observe the patient, probe the wound, and ask questions. Most strikingly, for each case, the author provides one of three verdicts: an ailment which I will treat, an ailment with which I will contend, or an ailment not to be treated. This last category is a testament to the physician's diagnostic honesty, an admission that some injuries were simply beyond their ability to cure. The treatments described are practical and largely non-magical, including instructions for stitching wounds shut with a needle and thread, setting fractured bones with wooden splints and linen bandages, and applying dressings of raw meat to stop bleeding. The Edwin Smith Papyrus reveals a sophisticated understanding of anatomy and a commitment to empirical observation that seemed centuries ahead of its time. The Egyptian understanding of anatomy was derived almost entirely from the practice of mummification. While this gave them a familiar, if not entirely scientific, Knowledge of the major organs, the process itself was a religious ritual, not a scientific dissection. The embalmers who removed the organs were a separate class from the physicians, and the act of cutting open a body was ritually impure. This prevented the kind of systematic anatomical investigation that would later form the basis of Western medicine. Their theory of physiology was centered on the concept of metu, a system of channels that they believed connected all parts of the body, originating from the heart. These channels were thought to carry not just blood, but also air, tears, saliva, and even malevolent spirits. Illness was often seen as a blockage or contamination of these channels. A physician might prescribe a laxative or an emetic to unblock the metu and purge the body of the harmful substance or spirit causing the sickness. The Egyptian pharmacopoeia was extensive. The medical papyri list hundreds of ingredients, many of which had genuine therapeutic properties. Willow bark, a natural source of salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin, was used for pain and inflammation. Honey, with its natural antibiotic properties, was frequently applied to wounds to prevent infection. Pomegranate was used to treat intestinal parasites, and mint was prescribed for gastric ailments. Other ingredients were chosen for magical reasons based on the principle of sympathy. An ingredient from a swift animal might be used to speed up childbirth, while a substance associated with a god might be used to invoke their healing power. These remedies were prepared as potions, to be drunk, poultices to be applied, or fumigants to be inhaled. Alongside the Swen worked other healers who focused more on the magical side. The Wab priest, or purity priest, might be called in to perform purification rituals. The scorpion charmer was a specialist who dealt with the very real danger of scorpion stings and snake bites, using a combination of magic spells and practical treatments. The lector priest, the Kurheb, was the master of sacred texts, and his powerful incantations were considered the most potent form of magical healing. For the average person, a trip to the local temple might be part of the healing process. They could leave an offering to a healing deity like Sekhmet, the fierce lioness goddess, who was believed to both cause and cure plagues, or Imhotep, the deified architect who later became a god of medicine. In some temples, the sick could spend the night in a special sanatorium in a practice known as incubation, hoping to receive a cure from the god in a dream. Despite this complex medical system, life was precarious. The average life expectancy was low by modern standards, likely around 30 to 35 years. Infant mortality was extremely high. Those who survived into adulthood faced a host of health problems. The gritty bread led to severe dental attrition, and without effective dentistry, this often resulted in painful abscesses and systemic infections that could be fatal. Parasitic diseases like schistosomiasis, contracted from snails living in the irrigation canals where farmers waded daily, were endemic and debilitating. Infectious diseases could sweep through the crowded villages. Skeletal remains show high rates of arthritis from a lifetime of physical labor. Sanitation was rudimentary. While the elite had basic bathrooms, for most people, waste was simply thrown into the street or a nearby canal, creating a breeding ground for disease. Yet, there was also a clear understanding of the importance of hygiene, at least for those who could afford it. Priests were required to be ritually pure, which involved frequent washing, shaving their entire bodies, and wearing clean linen garments. The wealthy also bathed regularly and used deodorants made from incense and spices. The common farmer, while soiled by his work, would wash in the river or canals. The Egyptians' meticulous attention to personal appearance, particularly their use of kohl eyeliner, was not just cosmetic. They believed the dark mineral paint helped to reduce the glare of the sun and acted as a fly repellent, thus preventing eye infections like trachoma, which was rampant. In the end, the Egyptian approach to medicine was a pragmatic response to the world as they understood it. It was a world where a broken bone was a physical problem to be set, but where a persistent fever was a spiritual assault to be fought with the power of words. Their healers were the guardians of the body's temple, armed with both the scalpel and the spell, battling to maintain health and restore Mat within the fragile, sacred vessel of the human form. In the sun-drenched landscape of ancient Egypt, where the clarity of the light seemed to demand a certain purity of form, personal appearance was a matter of profound importance. It was not an expression of vanity, but a reflection of social status, personal hygiene, religious belief, and even one's relationship with the cosmic order of Mat. The ideal Egyptian was clean, composed, and well-adorned, their outward appearance a mirror of their inner state and their place in the rigid social hierarchy. From the simple linen kilt of a farmer to the elaborate wig and jeweled collar of a nobleman, the way an individual presented themselves to the world was a visual language understood by all. This creation of the polished self was a daily ritual, a constant effort to achieve a state of grace and purity in a world that was often dusty and chaotic. The foundation of the Egyptian wardrobe for every level of society was linen. Cotton was unknown for most of pharaonic history, and wool, while available, was considered ritually impure and was rarely worn by the living, though it was sometimes used for blankets. Linen, woven from the fibers of the flax plant, was the fabric of choice. It was light, airy, and well suited to the hot climate. The production of linen was a lengthy and labor-intensive process, carried out primarily by women. After the flax was harvested, it was soaked, a process called retting, to separate the fibers, which were then beaten, combed, and spun into thread. The thread was then woven on looms, horizontal ground looms in the Old and Middle Kingdoms, and more advanced vertical looms in the New Kingdom. The quality of the resulting fabric varied enormously. The coarsest linen, rough and scratchy, would be used for sails or sacks. A farmer's kilt would be made of a sturdier, plain-weave linen. For the elite, weavers could produce linen of an astonishing fineness and softness, a semi-transparent, gossamer-like fabric known as royal linen, that was one of the most prized luxury goods of the ancient world. The vast majority of linen was left in its natural off-white color, which was associated with purity, though some garments could be dyed with mineral and plant extracts, with yellow and red being the most common colors. The style of clothing was remarkably stable through the centuries and was designed for simplicity and comfort. For men of the working class, the standard garment was a simple kilt or loincloth, a rectangular piece of linen wrapped around the hips and tied at the waist. This provided freedom of movement for physical labor. For officials and the elite, The kilt was longer and often made of finer pleated linen, a sign that its wearer did not engage in manual work. Over time, particularly in the New Kingdom, elite fashion became more elaborate, with men wearing long, flowing, transparent robes or tunics over their pleated kilts. Women, for most of Egyptian history, wore a simple, full-length sheath dress. This was a tube of linen that began under the breasts and was held up by two wide straps that went over the shoulders. The dress was form-fitting, and in art, it is often depicted as revealing the contours of the body, though in reality it was likely less restrictive to allow for movement. Like the men's kilt, the quality of the linen signified the wearer's status. In the New Kingdom, women's fashion also became more elaborate, with wealthy women wearing flowing, pleated gowns of diaphanous linen over their traditional sheath dresses, often with intricately draped sleeves. Children of both sexes typically wore no clothing at all until puberty, a practical adaptation to the climate. They were, however, often distinguished by their hairstyle, the sidelock of youth, where the head was shaved except for a single, long lock of hair braided on one side. The head was the crowning glory of the Egyptian self, and it received meticulous attention. Both men and women of the upper classes regularly shaved their heads completely. This was not just a fashion statement. It was a matter of hygiene, the most effective way to combat the persistent menace of head lice. In place of their natural hair, they wore elaborate wigs, which were status symbols in their own right. Wigs were crafted from human hair, supplemented with plant fibers and coated with beeswax and resin to hold their shape. The styles were varied and changed over time, from short, tight curls that fit like a cap to long, heavy, intricately braided tresses that cascaded over the shoulders. A nobleman might own several wigs for different occasions. For the working class who could not afford such luxuries, keeping their hair short was a practical alternative. Cosmetics were an essential part of the daily routine for both men and women of all social classes. The quintessential feature of the Egyptian face was the dramatic eye paint. Two colors were used, black and green. The black, known as kohl or mestimet, was made from finely ground galena, a dark gray lead ore. The green, aju, was made from malachite, a green copper carbonate ore. These minerals were ground into a fine powder on a slate palette and then mixed with a little water or oil to create a paste. This paste was applied around the eyes using a small stick of wood, bone, or ivory, creating the characteristic almond shape seen in all Egyptian art. This practice had multiple purposes. Aesthetically, it was believed to make the eyes appear larger and more beautiful. Practically, the dark kohl helped to reduce the fierce glare of the Egyptian sun, much like a modern athlete's eye black. Medically, the lead-based kohl had mild antibacterial properties and was believed to help prevent the eye infections that were a constant threat. And magically, the decorated eye was thought to invoke the protection of the Udjat eye of Horus, warding off the evil eye and malevolent spirits. Jewelry was another universal form of adornment, worn by everyone from the poorest farmer to the pharaoh himself. For the poor, jewelry might consist of a simple string of colored faience beads, a shell bracelet, or a clay amulet. For the wealthy, it was a spectacular display of wealth and status. Goldsmiths and lapidaries were masters of their craft, creating breathtaking pieces from gold, silver, electrum, and a wide array of semi-precious stones like lapis lazuli, carnelian, and turquoise. The most iconic piece of elite jewelry was the Wesek collar, a broad collar made of multiple rows of beads that covered the neck and shoulders. Bracelets, anklets, rings, and elaborate earrings, worn by both men and women after the Middle Kingdom, were also common. Much of this jewelry was not merely decorative, but also served a protective amuletic function. A carnelian bead was not just red, it embodied life force. A lapis lazuli pendant was not just blue, it contained a piece of the heavens. Finally, the polished self had to smell divine. In the hot, crowded conditions of ancient Egypt, personal scent was of great concern. The Egyptians were masters of perfumery. They created fragrant oils and ointments by infusing fats or oils with aromatic flowers, herbs, and resins. The blue lotus flower, with its intoxicating scent, was a favorite. Frankincense and myrrh, imported from the land of Punt, were highly prized. At banquets, both male and female guests were often depicted with a peculiar cone of perfumed fat, placed on top of their wigs. As the evening progressed, the heat would cause the cone to slowly melt, releasing its fragrance and casting a scented, moisturizing sheen over the wig and shoulders. Through these practices, the clean simplicity of linen, the cool comfort of a shaven head, the protective gaze of a kohl-rimmed eye, and the divine scent of lotus, the Egyptians constructed their identity. It was a vision of humanity at its best, ordered, pure, and beautiful, a worthy vessel for the eternal soul. The Egyptian fascination with death is one of their most famous characteristics. The pyramids, the Valley of the Kings, the golden treasures of Tutankhamun. These monumental efforts to defy mortality have captured the world's imagination for centuries. But these are the stories of the 1%, of the god kings and high nobles who could command the resources of the state to build their eternal homes. For the other 99%, the farmer, the craftsman, the potter, the soldier, the desire for a blessed afterlife was no less fervent, but their means of achieving it were vastly different. Their journey into eternity was not a grand procession into a painted tomb, but a humble, communal, and deeply personal affair, a testament to the universal human hope for life beyond death, enacted with the modest resources at hand. The fundamental beliefs about the afterlife were shared by all classes. Every Egyptian believed that a human being was a composite entity, made up of several spiritual parts. The most important of these were the Ka, the life force or spiritual double, and the Ba, the personality or soul, often depicted as a human-headed bird. Upon death, these elements separated from the physical body, the Khat. For an individual to achieve a successful afterlife, two things were essential. First, the body had to be preserved, as it was the anchor for the Ka and Ba, the home to which they could return. Second, the spirits needed a continuous supply of nourishment. If the body was destroyed or the spirit was forgotten and left unfed, the deceased would suffer a second, final death, an utter annihilation of their existence. This dual fear of bodily decay and of being forgotten drove the funerary practices of all Egyptians, rich and poor. For the poorest members of society, mummification was an unattainable luxury. Their afterlife was entrusted to the preserving power of nature itself. They were buried in simple, shallow pit graves dug into the hot, dry desert sand at the edge of the cultivation. The body was placed in a flexed or fetal position, perhaps echoing the position of a baby in the womb, a symbol of rebirth. It was wrapped in a simple reed mat or an old piece of linen. The natural aridity of the desert and the direct contact with the hot sand would quickly desiccate the body, effectively creating a natural mummy, preserving the physical form for the ka and ba. Buried alongside the body would be a few essential grave goods. A couple of pottery jars containing a small amount of grain or dried fish, and perhaps a clay bowl with a jar of beer. These were not lavish offerings, but the simple, practical necessities. For the journey ahead, a personal item like a well-worn amulet or a few cherished beads might also be included. This was the most basic form of Egyptian burial, one that relied on the eternal elements of the Egyptian landscape, the sand and the sun, to secure eternity. For a skilled craftsman in a village like dear el-Medina, or moderately successful farmer, something more elaborate was possible. This middle class could afford a form of artificial mummification and a more substantial tomb. When death occurred, the family would enter a period of intense ritualized mourning. The women of the household would lead the lamentations, wailing, tearing their clothes, and casting dust on their heads in a public display of grief. The body of the deceased would be taken to the local embalmers, who worked in temporary workshops, or designated areas known as the wabit or place of purification. The full 70-day mummification process of the royals was too expensive, but a shortened, more affordable version could be performed. The key ingredient was natron, a naturally occurring salt mixture from the Wadi al-Matron. The body was washed and then covered completely in a mound of dry natron, which would draw out all the bodily fluids over a period of about 40 days. While the internal organs were typically removed in elite mummification, in a more basic procedure they might be left in place or liquefied with an injected fluid. After the desiccation was complete, the body was cleaned, anointed with oils, and then wrapped in layers of linen bandages. The quality and quantity of the linen used was a direct reflection of the family's wealth. Protective amulets would be tucked within the bandages, and a simple mask made of cartonnage, a kind of ancient papier match of linen and plaster, might be placed over the head. The wrapped mummy was then placed in a coffin. For a person of modest means, this might be a simple rectangular wooden box. For those with more resources, it would be an anthropoid, human-shaped coffin, painted with the likeness of the deceased, along with protective symbols and hieroglyphic spells from the Book of the Dead, intended to help them navigate the dangers of the underworld. The funeral itself was a major community event. A procession would form, with the family, friends, and neighbors accompanying the coffin to its final resting place. Professional mourners might be hired to heighten the sense of grief. The coffin was dragged on a sledge, and behind it, servants or family members would carry the grave goods, furniture like a stool or a small bed, chests of clothing, boxes of cosmetic items, tools of the deceased's trade, and of course a great deal of food and drink. The tomb itself was a more permanent structure than a simple sand pit. A common type was a pit dug into the ground, roofed with timbers, with a small, simple chapel. built above it out of mud brick. This chapel, often with a small stela carved with the deceased's name and an offering formula, was the crucial point of contact between the world of the living and the world of the dead. It was here that the family would come to leave offerings. The burial ceremony culminated in the opening of the mouth ritual. A priest, using a set of special instruments, would touch the mouth, eyes, and ears of the mummified body or coffin, symbolically reawakening the senses so the deceased could eat, see, and hear in the afterlife. The grave goods for a middle-class burial were a microcosm of the deceased's life. Along with food and pottery, they would be buried with items they valued and would need in the next life. A scribe might be buried with his palette and pens. A soldier might have his favorite dagger. A woman would have her mirror, cosmetic pots, and jewelry. One of the most common and important grave goods was the shabdi. These were small figurines in the shape of a mummified person, often holding a hoe and a basket. They were intended to act as the deceased's magical servants in the afterlife. The Egyptians believed that the afterlife, the field of reeds, was a perfect reflection of Egypt, which meant there was work to be done farming, irrigating, and maintaining canals. If the deceased was called upon to perform this labor, they could magically delegate the task to their shabdi by reciting a spell from the Book of the Dead. A wealthy person might have 365 shabdis, one for every day of the year, plus overseers. A commoner might only have one or two, but the principle was the same. The relationship with the dead did not end at the funeral. It was an ongoing commitment. The family was expected to visit the tomb regularly, especially during major festivals, to leave fresh offerings and recite the names of the dead, for to speak their name was to make them live. These visits to the local necropolis were not just somber duties. They were often celebratory family picnics, a way of communing with the ancestors. The letters to the dead, written on pottery bowls left at tombs, showed just how real this connection was. People would write to their deceased relatives to ask for help, to complain about problems, or to seek their intervention in earthly affairs. The dead were not gone. They were simply living on another plane, and they remained active and powerful members of the extended family. From the simple sand pit to the decorated chapel, the funerary practices of the common Egyptian reveal a profound and universal conviction that every life was worth preserving for eternity, and that the bonds of family were strong enough to transcend even the great divide of death. The world of the average Egyptian peasant or craftsman can often seem remarkably insular, a self-contained universe bordered by the desert and governed by the timeless cycles of the Nile. Their lives were rooted in the black soil of their village, their identities forged by local traditions and community bonds. Yet this image of isolation is an illusion. The land of Egypt, despite its formidable desert barriers, was not a sealed container but a porous vessel, constantly interacting with the wider world. Echoes from abroad reverberated through the villages in the form of exotic goods, foreign people, and the tales of soldiers returning from distant lands. For the common person, the world beyond the Nile Valley was a place of mystery, danger, and opportunity, and its influence was a subtle but persistent thread in the fabric of their daily lives. The most direct connection to the outside world was through trade, while the local market, with its bartering of grain for pottery, was the center of the village economy. This was just the first link in a much longer chain. Egypt's ruling class had a voracious appetite for luxury goods that could not be found within Egypt's borders. This demand drove extensive trade networks that stretched far to the south, east, and north. State-sponsored expeditions, immense logistical undertakings, would travel to these foreign lands to acquire their treasures. One of the most important destinations was Nubia, the land to the south, rich in resources that Egypt craved. Great caravans would travel down the Nile, and armies would be sent to protect the trade routes and the Egyptian forts built along the river. From Nubia came vast quantities of gold, which the Egyptians called the flesh of the gods, as well as ivory, ebony, incense, and exotic animal skins. To the east, across the desert and the Red Sea, lay the fabled land of Punt, a semi-mythical place famous for its myrrh and frankincense, aromatic resins that were essential for temple rituals and the mummification process. Expeditions to Punt, like the famous one dispatched by Queen Hatshepsut, were major voyages involving both overland treks and seafaring ships. To the northeast, across the Sinai Peninsula, lay the Levant. From the port city of Byblus in modern-day Lebanon, Egypt imported the most crucial building material that its own landscape lacked: large, strong timbers of cedar wood, essential for building temple doors, royal barges, and high-quality furniture. From the wider Near East came silver, copper, and tin, as well as fine wines and olive oil. How did this elite trade affect the common farmer? Directly, very little. He would likely never see a piece of raw myrrh or a plank of cedar wood. But the indirect effects were significant. The construction of the great temples and palaces, which provided off-season corvée labor for thousands of farmers, was dependent on these foreign materials. More importantly, the men who powered these expeditions, the soldiers who guarded the caravans, the sailors who manned the ships, the Medjay Desert Scouts who patrolled the trade routes, were often recruited from the general population. A young man from a village might join the army and find himself marching deep into Nubia or campaigning in Syria. He would witness landscapes, cultures, and peoples completely alien to his own experience. If he was lucky enough to return, he would bring back not just a share of the plunder, but tales of strange gods, different customs, and foreign cities. These stories would filter through the village, expanding its mental map of the world. Furthermore, foreigners were a visible presence within Egypt itself. The official ideology, as seen in temple art, often depicted foreigners in a stereotypical and derogatory manner. The Nubians, Nehisu, were shown with dark skin and curly hair. The Libyans, Jehenu, with feathers in their hair and tattoos, and the Asiatics, Amu, with pointed beards and colorful robes. They were often shown as defeated enemies, bound and trampled under the Pharaoh's feet, a symbolic representation of Mat, triumphing over the chaos of the outside world. The reality on the ground, however, was far more complex and integrated. Foreigners came to Egypt for many reasons. Some came as prisoners of war, captured in military campaigns, who were then settled in Egypt as forced laborers or servants. Others came as skilled mercenaries. Entire divisions of the Egyptian army were composed of Nubian archers, Libyan warriors, or Shurden sea peoples, valued for their martial prowess. Many came as merchants and traders, settling in cosmopolitan port cities. In the Delta, creating vibrant immigrant communities. Over time, these foreign groups often assimilated into Egyptian society. They adopted Egyptian names, worshipped Egyptian gods, sometimes blending them with their own, and married into local families. A papyrus from the Middle Kingdom details the household of a landowner that includes over 90 servants, a significant portion of whom have Asiatic names. This shows that by this period, people from the Levant were a common and integrated part of Egyptian rural life. The influence of these foreigners can be seen in many aspects of Egyptian culture. New words entered. The Egyptian language. New technologies and artistic motifs were adopted. The horse and chariot, which would revolutionize the Egyptian military, were introduced by the Hyksos, a people of Asiatic origin who ruled northern Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period. Foreign deities, like the Canaanite war goddesses Astarte and Anat, were incorporated into the Egyptian pantheon, particularly by the warrior pharaohs of the New Kingdom. For the common person, their neighbor might be a second-generation Nubian. Their local garrison might be manned by Libyan soldiers, and the traveling merchant they bartered with might speak with a foreign accent. The experience of the Egyptian soldier was perhaps the most intense form of cross-cultural contact. A young conscript, pulled from his village, would be plunged into the disciplined, hierarchical world of the army. He would be trained, equipped, and marched for hundreds of miles. He would experience the terror of battle and the camaraderie of the barracks. If he served in the Levant, he would encounter fortified cities, different styles of warfare, and a multitude of small kingdoms. He might learn a few words of a foreign tongue or develop a taste for foreign wine. He would see that the world was much larger and more complicated than the eternal, predictable rhythm of the Nile. This experience would change him forever. The army was one of the few paths to social mobility, and a successful veteran could return to his village with land, gold, and immense prestige, his elevated status a direct result of his engagement with the world outside. Thus, the seemingly quiet world of the Egyptian village was constantly brushed by these echoes from abroad. The amulet a woman wore might be made of lapis lazuli that began its journey in a mine in distant Afghanistan. The bronze tool a craftsman used was an alloy of Egyptian copper and imported tin. The bedtime story a father told his children might be a version of a Canaanite myth he heard from a fellow soldier. The foreigner was not just an enemy to be defeated on a temple wall. They were a neighbor, a soldier, a slave, a merchant. Egypt's immense strength and stability did not come from impenetrable isolation, but from its supreme confidence in its own culture, a confidence so strong that it could absorb foreign peoples, technologies, and ideas, and make them Egyptian. The gaze of the common farmer was fixed on his field, but his world was subtly shaped and colored by the vast and complex network of connections that tied his timeless land to the wider world. As our journey comes to a close, we leave the sun-drenched fields and bustling villages of ancient Egypt behind, but we carry with us a more nuanced and relatable picture of this incredible civilization. By shifting our focus from the monumental to the mundane, we discover that the true marvel of Egypt was not just its ability to build for eternity, but its capacity to foster vibrant, resilient communities. We've walked through villages built of earth and community, where life was governed by the rhythms of the Nile, We've felt the comforting weight of a magic amulet and understood that justice, in the form of Matt, was a right worth fighting for, even for the commoner. We've seen how a world of limited education still passed down vital skills through generations, and how, in the midst of hard labor, there was always time for a game of Senate, a shared story, or a loving gesture. This was the Egypt of the farmer, the craftsman, the woman managing her household, and the child playing in the dusty streets. It was a world infused with a deep sense of order, a practical application of magic, and a profound appreciation for the simple joys of life. The golden masks of the Pharaohs will always hold their power, but the enduring spirit of ancient Egypt is found in the everyday lives of its people, a world as vital and compelling as any legend carved in stone. Thank you for joining me on this journey.